a look at the agenda and enter the names as present as usual.
Okay, we're live.
This is the July 18th Node.js modules meeting. We've got quite a packed agenda today. Initially, we've got 15 minutes to update on a lot of progress and various items that are happening. And these are each a 3-minute time box. So I think it's worth just getting straight into it so we don't go over. The first item we've got is that Miles has been working on a pull request that implements import.meta.require in Node call. And so we've got 3 minutes to discuss any thoughts and feedback on this approach and what people, does anyone want to specifically introduce the approach here for import.meta.require and talk about it a little bit first? Bradley?
So import.meta.require, at least in this PR, is being used as the way to load CommonJS. We've often talked about the ability to import CommonJS. This is kind of an alternative route where you use import.meta.require as a entirely disparate module system. So you don't connect the CommonJS module system to the ESM module system. And so there are a variety of reasons you might want to do this. There are still a lot of design concerns to talk about with this. I have like several comment threads about this. And so I don't know, I'm a little bit biased here. So that's my explanation.
Does anyone want to comment their thoughts on it? Good or bad? What's the general position? Benjamin?
Sure. I just have a question for Bradley. I've been persuaded in the past that the fact that import meta.require is like an imperative function call. You like can't get it to happen before imports, which is one argument for transparent interop with importing CommonJS with import declarations. Do you agree with the following statement though? If you really wanted to get the import.meta.require call to sort of interleave with other ECMAScript modules evaluation, you could just like create a wrapper ECMAScript module that only calls import.meta.require and then import that in the sequence of other import declarations, or is that still not good enough for the ordering concerns that you had?
So let's start with it's not the only concern, but that does let you do the proper timing of what you want to do. We've had objections around using wrapper files for a variety of issues, and so there are some of the same arguments there. People arguing that things like named imports from CommonJS need to exist, and we can't use MJS wrappers for those. Kind of the same deal here for me. We could encourage that behavior, but it's not the biggest problem to me. The lack of synchronization between the two module systems causing both ambiguity and potential oddities is bigger.
We've already hit time for this item. I think the idea was to kind of update on where we are on this, and then maybe people can go and have a look at it and put some more thought to it as well in terms of what they think of the implementation. Jordan, do you want to, can you keep it sort of to 30 seconds?
Yeah, so I don't want to dive into it now, but just I have a philosophical objection to the PR unrelated to its technical content, which is that it represents an implementation for something for which we do not yet have consensus. I really don't want us to build cars when we don't know what kind of car we're building. And so I'd like to have, like we had talked last week about having some time, the majority of the meeting this week, to kind of discuss that. So this time box isn't it, but hopefully later this meeting will be.
Sure. I don't think we've actually got a time specifically to focus on this, but maybe when we get to the some of the thoughts about the features list, and maybe if there's a bit of time on the end with transparent interrupt, we can fit some thoughts in here. Okay, so we're like a couple of minutes over, but the next one's an important one, thinking about deadlines. And so this is the post that Miles put up, basically saying that there's quite a strict deadline to get in for Node 12 LTS, and what we think about that, and in terms of how we're going to steer a lot of the work that we're doing around those deadlines, and if those deadlines can form part of our constraints or not. Does anyone have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, same sort of thing. I think if expediency was the goal, we wouldn't have convened this working group because decisions were already made. The purpose of this group is not to ship modules fast; it's to ship them to increase our confidence that we're shipping them correctly for whatever feature set that means. So I think that in no way should we be accelerating towards shipping until we've at least agreed upon roughly what we're going to build, and we're not close to that.
Bradley?
There was a recent issue and a thought that's been going around kind of in private amongst some members about creating a minimal implementation and what that would be. There's the issue 153 on GitHub for modules. I do think we can achieve an easier timeline if we can agree upon a base, absolute minimal, virtually unusable even, implementation that we can kind of use as a stepping stone to reach some level of consensus. And I think we would not ship that unflagged, but I would heavily think that that might be a better approach than our current all or nothing approach. So we can reach consensus on individual features one at a time rather than everything.
Definitely. Jan?
Yeah. Two quick things. First quick thing, I think it would help if we would try to focus just on changes since the last meeting, because I feel like we are basically having some of the discussions that we had last week again, which I don't think is a good use of those 3 minutes. The second thing is, I don't think we have anybody taking notes right now.
Yeah, that's a good point. Does someone want to take notes? I see lots of people with hands up. Bradley? Or is that for comments?
I forgot to raise or lower.
Okay, sure. Jan? I'm just going to go on because we need to try and keep to time today. Benjamin, that would be great. Thanks. Definitely agreed that we need to be thinking in terms of. I think if we can use the deadlines as something that we can at least guide some of our process, but yeah, it's difficult to set a hard constraint on. It's difficult to also come to conclusions in 3 minutes on this. All right, let's have a look at the terminology documents. This is something that we're making some progress on in terms of trying to document, to have a shared understanding of a lot of the terms that are involved here. I think transparent interrupt is one of the terms that we decided to deprecate and no longer use, and instead talk about require interrupt or import interrupt. And in terms of maintaining this document going forward, there's probably going to be more decisions like that. Does anyone want to update on this document? Was it Salah who was managing this? Yeah, we don't have anyone here today who's been involved in this document. But if I can then just speak to what I think might be useful, it would be to have the document become something that's referenced as a sort of a living document is just what I was suggesting today, that we can then update as we come to decisions on terms, and then keep that updated as we're going through. So we make sure that we keep a baseline of where we are on terms. Do people have any thoughts on that? Jan?
I think as the general updates, last week, Miles and someone else was saying that they wouldn't make any progress this week, but next week they would be digging back into making that document more useful and filling it out.
Okay, yeah, that would be great. And I mean, even what's there already is very useful information, and I think it would be nice to kind of promote it as something that we can kind of stick with as a living document. But let's get an update then from them on that next week. Developer survey. Who wants to introduce this? Michael, you weren't involved in the process on this at all, were you? On the developer survey from the Node side, or?
In terms of getting like a survey to ask questions, I've been involved in a couple of the other ones, and I'm part of the user feedback group, so I can help to facilitate that. But in terms of getting the questions, I think we need this group to basically agree on what those are, and then we can move it forward. Right.
So in terms of basically coming up with what are the right questions to be investigating so that we can do our jobs here, and maybe just to find out what those blanket expectations are for users right now in terms of how they see things, how they imagine things, because those sort of automatic responses that we assume how we think of things, to find out what users think of those same things. So like, would they expect to see certain things working in different ways? And ideally, I guess we should be working towards putting together some of these items that we can then review in the meetings, as opposed to trying to come up with them in the meetings. Does anyone want to start putting together some thoughts on what might be good survey questions?
I can try to find time, but I have TC39 next week.
Sure. Anyone else? Okay, well, Bradley, I mean, it doesn't need to be a huge job. I think just somewhere to start that we can iterate on in between meetings would be amazing to see moving forward.
Yeah, I think if there's an open issue, you put in your first thoughts, even Bradley, like, then that'll probably sort of spur other people to start throwing those in and get the conversation going.
Yeah, that could be very useful around a lot of these questions where we have to assume users expect this to work or expect things to look a certain way or not. Great. Jan, you've had your hand up? Or is that still from last time? Bradley?
I just want to make a comment that I don't think our user survey should be just about expectations. We certainly can violate user expectations. And there's going to be some question about need.
Sure, thanks, Bradley. All right, and then the last one was one I managed to sneak in here on the agenda. I posted a PR with some adjustments to the features list, marking some duplications, and just trying to update it as well as some of the features that have been noted more recently that aren't on that README page. It seems like it's worth keeping the README up to date from my perspective, just because it's the first thing people see when they land on the page. I'm posting the request there. Sorry, Michael, could you promote?
Yep, sorry, doing it now.
So if anyone has any thoughts on this, we don't have a quorum. We're like 2 away from quorum. There is currently some approvals. if anyone wants to approve that now, I would be very grateful. I think it would be good to keep this list up to date, or if you have some time to look at it later. What I would like to do ideally as well is maybe start moving towards splitting up this features list into goals. So ordering them by like what type of features they are and what milestones they're applied to. So that's what I wanted to do after this. So it'd be great if we can do this as a first step. And then second, I wanted to just try and split it up by like, this is baseline, this is loaders, this is whatever feature applies, if that makes sense. Okay, so those are the updates for now. And no one has any other comments on that. So we can then move into the discussion. The first item for discussion was package name maps. And I believe we wanted to just discuss this briefly and in terms of how this applies here. Would anyone like to introduce the topic?
I mean, I can talk about my understanding of it.
Sure.
Basically, it's a static file that can be provided to a browser via some sort of like a link tag or something that tells the browser how to resolve import specifiers, specifically bare import specifiers. So like if you have import React from React, how does the browser know where the string React comes from? And so a package name map would provide a kind of static mapping from the specifier to a final URL. And that package name map also has kind of structure in it so that you can have nested things. Like you can say anything that starts with foo, follows this URL mapping, and then it just dumps whatever's after it. So like so if you're doing deep imports, for example, you could do anything that's under // goes under a certain URL, things like that. The relevance to us is that it seems useful that people, number one, should be able to easily create a package name map by default, so that they can take their node in their, the code that runs in Node and is installed with npm and so on, and use it in a browser. And then separately, the question is, should Node itself have some sort of support for, I want to provide a package name map and use that instead of the default resolution algorithms. And then, yeah, so that's my understanding of how it relates to us. I don't know if anyone has thoughts.
Bradley.
I think Jordan summed it up fairly well. I think people are making assumptions about the limits of package name maps without fully investigating the feature set it provides. So I would like to see more engagement, at least in depth, for using it to do things like you can resolve directories using them, and you can even resolve missing file extensions using them. So I think package name map compatibility is much wider than a lot of people coming in are thinking it is. So I just encourage everybody to think out of the box. And that's it.
Sure, thanks. Jeffrey? Michael, did you want to mention something?
Yeah, I can't put my hand up in the tool. So
sure, okay.
My question just was like, how does this fit into the overall priorities? It sounds like something that maybe helps us in terms of not having to worry about bare imports or whatever, but is it something that we need to prioritize in terms of compatibility, or is it something we can sort of think about later on?
I was about to say something that actually addresses that, if I can try to respond to that.
Sure.
So yeah, I was going to say that my concern is that I'm trying to avoid code that can execute in browsers, like the same code executing in Node and browsers and just behaving differently in both for whatever reason, because an import specifier gets resolved differently in the two would be like a common reason that they would run differently. So in that sense, it's a compatibility concern for me. And so like one thing that was discussed was like, well, if they're importing a package and it doesn't have a package name map, well, then we can use, you know, whatever Node's current algorithm is. And then if the package name map is present, then Node will like prefer that instead, which could work. But then it's like, as packages add these things, there could be breaking changes in terms of like other, you know, downstream apps that do imports from them. Suddenly the imports don't resolve on the new version the way they did before. I mean, which could always have happened in general if they were doing a deep import and the package author changed their path. So maybe that's not such a big concern. I don't know. I'm just raising it as a concern. But I do think there's a lot of value in aligning with the browser on this, since, you know, having the same code execute the same way in both places is definitely a positive for the ecosystem. Did that answer your question or not really?
We've got quite a few hands up here. Bradley, were you responding to that?
Yes. I'm just saying I completely disagree and don't think it is the same level of compatibility concern as Jeffrey. Node and the web browsers are going to vary in a lot of ways, and we need to determine what subset is compatible between them. We aren't going to enter a master-slave relationship ever because of these incompatibilities in a variety of ways. So I think we're going to have compatibility concerns greater than package name maps, and using them as a blunt instrument is.
So what do you see as the compatibility issues for package name maps?
For package name maps, I don't see direct compatibility problems with supporting the subset of resolution in both environments. I see bigger problems with how caching works, how import.url works, things like how importing JSON can work, HTML modules. There's this whole slew of things, and we aren't a subset of the web.
And then what about things like automatic extensions for relative paths?
So you can put those in package name maps right now today. I can send you files if you want, showing you. You use tools to generate package name maps, and your tool can resolve ahead of time and put in entries ahead of time.
The thing is, though, package name maps can only map bare names. So if you've got a / something, it won't be able to automatically add an extension.
Yes, but package name maps aren't even a complete specification. They aren't accepted anywhere.
Right.
Package name maps can be extended to satisfy that use case. There are alternatives to package name maps like loader hooks. There are a ton of things going on, and we can't master slave a relationship on this.
Certainly. Okay, we've already gone over time on the topic. Jordan, did you, Michael, I know you had your hand up there as well. Has your question been answered?
My last question was, and maybe it's because I haven't looked at them enough though, is I'm guessing in the browser, some of those, like the mapping from the bare name maybe to an external URL. And I can't see that Node's going to want to support that necessarily directly, because that changes the whole security model, right? So I just see some, that makes me wonder if there's like a fundamental level of compatibility.
That's one side of it. I think it doesn't necessarily have to, have the same package name map between Node and browsers. I mean, you could have a browser-specific version that uses URLs, and then a Node-specific version that's using local files. So
that sort of automatically then means that, like, part of the early discussion was around, well, if you change one thing, it might break the other thing. But as soon as you have two copies,
there's definitely some question there.
Weakens that story a bit. That's all.
But it's difficult for us to solve the story. I think we can focus on compatibility, and for me personally, relative paths is the big compatibility one. If we want to stop automatic extensions for relative paths, because that's the one thing that you'd be able to write a node that wouldn't necessarily work in the browser.
I think that's a limitation purely upon the people designing package name maps. I don't think that's actually a browser problem.
So I guess I was coming at that, like, does it make sense to focus on, like Bradley just said, maybe provide input to the people working on package name maps to help address the compatibility issues, as opposed to thinking that our first priority is to actually implement them for Node? I don't know, just trying to find some way to prioritize from all, there's tons of work to get to where we want to get.
I don't see this as a high priority personally. I don't know what other people think. We're already over time for this one, so John, you put your hand down. Sorry, I kept you hanging there. If you wanted to finish that off briefly or have closing comments here.
It's not going to add value today.
Sure, thanks. All right. Maybe just thinking in terms of where we need to be positioning package name maps. I think if we get back to a sense of priorities, if anyone thinks there are any specific priorities around package name maps that we should be focusing on or that we should be presenting for the package name maps proposal, then definitely please mention that. Great. Bradley, did you want to kick off the loaders presentation?
So there's absolutely zero chance we'll finish it in 20 minutes, so we're going to go fast and we're going to see how it goes. Originally, I requested, I think, 40 minutes.
Okay, sorry. No, it's like going through this stuff quickly, but
can people see this? Maybe ESM loaders.
Yep, got that.
Cool. We're just going to roar through this. So the purpose of this presentation is to try to get people to stop thinking of loaders as some magical amorphous thing that lets you do anything you want, and more in a concrete sense, what they are, what they can do, what they must do, and in that sort of sense. So what is an ESM loader? Whenever I'm talking about an ESM loader, I'm talking about something that uses the ECMAScript spec hooks in order to instrument the ESM module system, which essentially comes down to you control how import works. You don't get to change fancy things about how modules work. You don't get to change, create new module systems and stuff like that. You can do that at the host layer, but that's not what a loader is doing. It's just how you instrument import. So this is kind of split up into a maybe controversial idea that an implementation of ESM is some host that provides a full default loader that instruments the spec such that it can actually load code. There are some invariants that must be left up to the host platform and loaders. Generally, the APIs we're going to use to create an implementation are not the same as your spec text. And we're not going to actually discuss anything about shipping a full implementation. We're just talking about how to instrument those import hooks, because that's all the spec gives us. There's a note on conformance. We have this come up every so often. Basically, there are some conformance constraints that the spec provides. Optimization, especially hidden optimization, is fine. There are even callouts in the ECMAScript spec saying it's kind of expected. And there's even contradictory spec text, which wouldn't work in the real world because it would leak memory forever and stuff like that. So when we talk about conformance, we're talking about observable effects, not about implementation. Spec isn't implementation. Whew. So let's talk about the hooks that we got to work with. Host resolve imported module. This used to be called something else. Now it's called this. It intercepts all static import requests. You must return a module record for a request. You can return any kind of module record you want. It must extend abstract module record, which is basically this abstract base class for all kinds of modules, for WASM, for JS, CommonJS, JSON, anything you can think of. It's all got to be put on top of abstract module record somehow. That means it could subclass other things that are concrete classes. Essentially, you always are going to be giving the same module record back whenever you get a referring module, the module doing the import, and the string specifier provided. This is a spec idempotency conformance requirement. It is not optional. Generally, we represent referring modules as string, but really it's another module record. So just keep that in mind as we go on through this. This is generally what I call the resolve hook. Host import module dynamically does the exact same thing, except for import as a function, dynamic import. It has the same idempotency requirement, so it better work the exact same as static import, because once you statically import something, it also sets it for what's dynamically imported. Okay. So what does the resolve hook kind of do, and what is it? It's how we intercept all imports. That's the entire feature set of what loaders can do. They can't make bindings work differently. They can't suddenly change how scoping or variables work inside of another file. There are ways to do that, but it's not direct. And we have to just kind of follow all the requirements. So the requirements. You get two parameters in these hooks from the spec. You get the referring module, which is some module record, and you get a specifier, which is a string. So when you import FS, you get the referring module, whatever it is, your app.js is module record, and the string FS. And you have to go and generate some kind of module record for it. Doesn't really matter how you generate the module record for it. So there's essentially two things we can do when we're generating module records. If we return a module record and we want to create a new type, we're going to take something like, for example, module.exports equals 123. We're going to actually create a source text module record just because that's the only concrete class of abstract module record V8 lets us do anything with. And we're going to convert it to roughly the string export default, and then a way to get that module.exports. So we haven't modified that CommonJS code at all. Whew.
Bradley, are you taking questions, or do you want to leave questions for after?
Just wait, and there is a halfway point. We're going to get to the halfway point.
Okay. Jeremiah had a question, but maybe we can bring that up at the middle. Okay.
Okay, so when you do not modify the thing you're loading, we're going to call that a facade. Facade is from the Gang of Four book. It's a design pattern basically that says you take some value, some API, and you do not modify it, but you create another API in order to use it. So we are strictly not modifying this module.exports equals 123 when we create what I'm going to call facades. The alternative is something that things like code coverage need to do, or Babel, where you transform the source text into something else. Whew. So I'm going to call transformation of source text to source text compiling. Just so we have some clear terms. Facade, you do not modify source text, and compiling, you do modify source text. And there's a reason that I want to do that, and we'll see if we can get to it. In general, the reason why I want to point out facades is if we are to ship ESM, we should do neither of these things. We should not create a facade for existing source text that is in the module goal, and we should not compile it to something else. So yeah, I'm going a little fast. I'm skipping over some points, but we're going. So what have we implemented? So far, we have this -- loader CLI flag you can use in order to generate a loader. Currently, our loader has 3 parameters: the specifier, the parent module URL, and a default resolver. There is a PR to support multiple loaders, which changes default resolver to parent resolver. So yeah. And you always return some URL string right now, and some format. It's an enum. Dynamic is a specialized way of creating facades, basically. Yeah. And my overall review right now is when we get multiple loaders, we do need to kind of move away from this idea of the default loader and just have the parent loader that we delegate to. We return a URL string, but it's not always a URL. It could be something like fs, which is a little weird. So probably just want to rename that. And format is kind of this weird enum. So maybe we should standardize it on it. If you've heard me harping about using MIME types, this is kind of in part from review of our current loader. Dynamic is also kind of special, and we should make it more capable than it already is, and that's probably a big API design change. Right now, it's limited to facade capabilities roughly, and we should probably think about more direct support for compilation, where you can ship a full body of source text back. So this is pretty much the halfway point. We can drain questions and anything I said wrong.
Jeremiah, did you want to raise your question now?
I think my connection might be having a little bit of trouble. If you can hear me. So I just wanted to, I was just wondering if the host resolve methods that you mentioned at the beginning, the two of them, are those synchronous, or is it possible to return like a promise from them or something?
They are untimed. So they are neither synchronous nor asynchronous. There's algo-ish. There are problems if you try to treat them as synchronous, though. So in reality, okay, you kind of have to make them asynchronous.
Got it.
Michael, did you have a question there?
Yeah, I was wondering, on one of the slides you said we shouldn't do facades or compilation to remain spec compliant. Why not?
So if we are taking something and compiling it to the module goal, it isn't the module goal originally. Does that make sense?
I guess I thought the point of using loaders, particularly the non-default ones, would be to take something and to change them, like either by changing the content, or maybe the facade could add in something or remove things. But if we're not supposed to do either of those, then I was just wondering.
So userland has slightly different things. This statement about compliance is specifically about us in our default loader. When we say something is ESM, we don't touch it. It is just loaded directly through a module record that hasn't been changed in any of the ways you just said.
Okay, and why would we do otherwise?
Because sometimes people like to, a good one would be if we were to reorder the evaluation of imports, we would need to change the source text to reorder the imports. And so we have changed the semantics of our source text to be something that does not load directly in the spec. We've had to alter it before we hand it off to what the spec controls.
Bradley, are you referring to the fact that we have this kind of wrapping up where we're writing this intermediate source text to represent CommonJS?
I am only talking about ESM because that's just what the spec cares about. I think we can do facades for whatever we want. We can compile whatever we want, but we cannot use facades or compilation and say what was the input was ESM.
So basically, if we take in ESM, you're saying by default, we shouldn't change it.
Yes. I'm saying we will violate the spec if we call it ESM, but are forced to change it before handing it to the spec.
So then could you just explain then what happens when the input is CommonJS? Like, are we...
That is outside of the spec. There's no CommonJS goal in ECMA 262. As long as we return any kind of module record, it doesn't care. ESM has a specific concrete module record type in the ECMAScript spec. You can create other module record types outside of ECMAScript.
So what is the source text that we're actually passing to V8 to run? Like, are we converting module.exports into an export statement, or
no,
are we kind of just like creating a facade that somehow deals with that kind of stuff, but it still like runs the original CommonJS code?
Yes, we essentially run this module.exports equals 1, 2, 3. And that's what we're going to evaluate. We do not touch that right now in our implementation. It is unchanged. And we create a separate module record, which we do some extra bookkeeping. It's more than this, in order to create the module record that roughly equates to the source text I have highlighted ahead of evaluation, so it can be done during instantiation and linked properly. And then eventually when we get to evaluations, way of getting module exports will either run or use the cached value from running that CommonJS. But they're entirely separate source texts.
Promote again, sorry.
Sure.
Bradley, you're at 15 minutes, slightly over 15 minutes. If you need to go over a little bit, that's okay. I think we're going to probably reduce the transparent interrupt time.
So yeah, we have these two entirely different source texts, and we're using a facade written in a source text module record format in order to pass a value from the CommonJS module system into ESM, which does not have a direct way to like magically accept objects. Does that answer your question, Jeffrey?
Yes, thanks.
Cool. So we got really short amount of time. I have a proposed path kind of in here. I don't have time to really go over it. Let's just kind of summarize. I would like to move the loaders off the main thread and isolate them more. Moving them off the main thread means we can do some compute heavy things like babel in parallel or even scale them to multiple threads. I have a proof of concept if anybody wants to talk to me about it. It's totally not ready and is proving a very big pain point to rebase onto Node. We can do a bunch of other things according to how to communicate stuff. How do you integrate with this resolve hook API? Right now, we have the command line argument with -- loader. Eventually, we may get multiple loaders, so multiple -- loaders. The environment variable node options lets you pass in loaders. So this is great for APMs and stuff because it's put in front of any command line argument, actually. There's an idea of per package loader hooks. Some people are opposed to it. It's something we should think about. It has some features of isolation that I like, and it works for hash bangs, which I also like. So big differences between my proposal and kind of what we have. We're just kind of changing the term URL for the parameters, and we're changing from our slightly less straightforward spec mechanism for this dynamic format to let us return a body. So we, instead of only having the facade capabilities, which has a few problems, I think we should totally just let resolve return a source text and format pair so that it's like, oh, this is a well-known format that Node knows how to transform into ESM. So WASM, whatever. It's like, oh, I know how to load that format, and here's the body. And so we can get the compilation workflows more directly. Yeah. So I have a research branch. It's doing a bunch of stuff. We can use threads to instrument require. That's actually a lot more difficult if we're on the main thread for loader hooks. I don't even know if it's possible. I think looking into having the same mechanism for loaders for both require and import would be really nice. Basically, what happens when we're talking about threads and performance is we sacrifice some serialization time. It's not too big usually, but it's visible. In order to let people do stuff in parallel, you can kind of have multiple loaders go all over the place. There are animations to those slides, which make it much more interesting. But there's also like the idea, if you have 3 threads for your Babel loader, you can do 3 concurrent Babel compilations at the same time because it's a blocking operation currently in Babel. So, yeah. And then there's some head of line mitigations that we can do by moving the loaders off the main thread. In particular, I still haven't gotten clarification from V8 about off-thread parsing. People talk about it, but it doesn't look like it's actually possible without blocking the main thread, given the APIs that we have available. I will continue to bother them. So. And then we just need to be sure whatever default loader we do, we don't want to put it on the main thread. Otherwise, it'll block the main thread. We can do that in its own thread or the topmost loader thread, either or. So yeah, and then this is just showing you can use atomics weight to block the main thread while you're performing some loader tasks, such as instrumenting require. The API I have proposed has a lot of problems around caches because the web is not going to perform caching the same way that Node has done ever, or any tool that I've found ever. So if we want to allow instrumenting the cache, kind of what I talked about earlier, where you can import something and then the loader returns FS or something, we need a way to control where that eventually ends up in the cache if we want to allow full web compatibility. I personally don't think it's worth it because of how weird it is. I would not recommend people do caching how the web works. So we can do it, but I would prefer to remove that from my proposal. And I don't know how other people feel about that. So that's it. I tried, but 20 minutes is short. So any other questions?
How's your prototype behaving at the moment? Is it something that can be built and run?
I am currently trying to rebase it into Node's master, but it is really nasty to rebase. It works as a userland loader, ironically, right now. So you could ship it as a userland loader, but you don't get any of the head of line mitigations or any of that nice stuff. It works. It's reasonably fast. I'm trying to make it faster because it's a naive implementation, and I think we could have better proof of concept of caching with it. A big thing I want to prove out is you can use this loader to do all the transformations ahead of time in a somewhat generic way. So if somebody does TypeScript, you can have this like caching loader ahead of TypeScript and make it very minimal interaction with TypeScript, just saying if something needs to be rebuilt or not with that caching loader. So one of the big problems with all these loaders is just the raw amount of time people can spend doing transformations and things like that. Babel is not cheap, and we should try to avoid doing it on every run. And that means we need to make caching, the workflow, simple. And that's hard. I haven't figured out how to make it simple. I've made it workable, but not simple.
If I may share just some thoughts on this, it's where we hit up against hard problems that we don't necessarily know how to solve. I mean, it sounds like your experience dealing with the problem can help to work out how we can set the right boundaries around the problem in our APIs. Because we do have to at some point decide what the boundary is between what we're creating in the APIs and what we're expecting from user land. And we do have to draw a line in terms of how much we can solve and how much we expect to be solved in user land. Yeah. Did you have any thoughts on that, Bradley?
I agree, and that's largely why I really don't want to put web caching as a capability of these loaders, because it is a can of worms. Anytime you let somebody modify your cache, it's very difficult. I think for the compilation addition of capabilities to loaders, I think it's just kind of a necessary feature, and you start having to account for people using this for source code transforms that are very expensive. And I don't think I can solve the caching usability problem, but I can show it can be done. And that's all I'm seeking to do, is just like push it out to people other than myself once I've proven there's a workflow, because that's it.
Sure, we've gone over time now to hit transparent interrupt for today. Michael, if you have to leave on the dot, does that mean, I take it that means we have to shut down the chat?
I think I can probably make you the host.
Right.
So I'll do that, and then
we
drop off.
Hopefully won't go much over. I think given that transparent interrupt is off for today, did anyone want to talk more about loaders or go back to some of the time-boxed items from the beginning of the meeting and follow up that? I know we've got Salah present if we wanted to discuss the terminology document again. And we could also perhaps discuss deadlines briefly again. Does anyone want to suggest anything? No suggestions. In that case, Salah, are you available to chat?
Yeah, I'm here.
Did you want to maybe give an update on the terminology? We were discussing it earlier and saying that it could be worth considering what the next steps are on that. If it's something that's good enough to either merge into the repo or something like that.
Like from my end, I really did nothing since last week about this. There has been no progress anyways. Like I came in a bit late today, so I didn't really catch the conversation bit. But I don't think what we have, like we have two documents at the moment. We have one that is like, I went way overboard, and then another that was an attempt to try to steer this in a new direction. And that was, I guess, just inputs from one or two people. So between those two is a middle ground, I think, that a document should be like before we actually merge anything. So I don't like we have two extremes really at this point. I guess
do you think we could potentially move forward with either putting it in as a document in the repo or linking to it from the resources document so that it's something that we can maintain going forward? Would you be interested in creating a PR for that?
Sorry, that last bit I didn't hear.
So I was thinking either adding it into the resources as a link to the Google Doc that we maintain as a live doc, or alternatively creating as its own markdown file in the modules repo.
Yeah, I think I'm actually gonna just hash out a middle ground document until before next week, definitely.
Sure.
And that middle ground document, I'm gonna consider actually doing it a markdown document, and then we can just you know, it depends on how everybody else feels, if they want to have that as a markup document or, sorry, markdown document, or they would rather be able to just edit a Google Doc. I think a markdown document is good enough. We can all edit that if we're able. If we have permission to just, you know, make pull requests. But if people want to have more input before we actually go to that stage, then we can just stick with Google Doc. I'll leave it up to everyone, I guess.
Does everyone agree that a markdown document is okay for that? Okay, sure, thanks. If anyone wants to bring up anything else, let me know. Otherwise, theoretically, we have 5 more minutes because we started 5 minutes late. But otherwise, we can drop the YouTube stream unless anyone else wants to bring up any other topics for today. And we've got Jay Dalton. All right. Thanks, everyone. See you next time.
Later.
Cheers.